We have a great lineup of folks who are going to be here tonight, including Dr. Mark Summers, and we've got three partners from the local media. So we have Kelly from Unmonumental and With Good Reason. We have David, they're all kind of back by our video, David from RVA Mag, and James from the Richmond Times-Dispatch. So we're going to hear from them a little bit more in the second half of our program after Dr. Summers does a quick talk. For those of you who are new to the Foundry series, we'll start off with Dr. Summers' presentation, which will anchor us in the Civil War era, take a quick break, and spend the second half of our program exploring these connections between the past and the present. So our panelists will ask questions of each other, but also at that point is when we'll open it up to you all to be able to have that kind of back and forth with our panelists too. Mark Walgren Summers is the Thomas D. Clark Professor of History at the University of Kentucky in Lexington. He's the author of many books, including The Press Gang, Newspapers and Politics, 1865 to 1878, The Presidency and Political Cartoons, 1776 to 1976, and A Dangerous Stir, Fear, Paranoia, and the Making of Reconstruction. His current research includes a study of the mechanics of Gilded Age politics and the Andrew Johnson impeachment. So without any further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Summers.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you. Okay. Welcome aboard, everyone. I'm glad to see you, and I'll try to make this as brief as I possibly can, but being a professor and used to sort of 50-minute periods, that probably means I'll just have to talk, especially quickly. Let me ask a question to start out with that may not seem pertinent, but might be. Okay, how many of you have read any Charles Dickens novels? Any of you? Good. Which ones have you read? Oliver Twist, of course. Isn't that wonderful? Okay, what else? Tale of Two Cities. Good. Anything else? Which one?
Great Expectations.
Great Expectations. Marvelous thing. Our Mutual Friend. Magnificent kind of thing. Any of you read Martin Chuzzlewit? Besides me? Didn't think so. No. Okay. Yeah, well, I bring up Martin Chuzzlewit for reasons. It was not one of his greatest novels, but it wasn't bad. And in it, his character, Martin, actually comes to America, and the picture of America that he gives is not a friendly one. As a matter of fact, Martin Chuzzlewit only just lands on the shores of America when he is immediately assaulted by the most aggressive and unscrupulous class in all of New York City. I am, of course, referring to newsboys out there. And here, and I read you from Martin Chuzzlewit. Here's morning's New York sewer, cried one. Here's this morning's New York stabber. Here's the New York family spy. Here's the New York private listener. Here's the New York peeper. Here's the New York plunderer. Here's the New York keyhole reporter. Here's the New York rowdy journal. Here's all the New York papers. Here's full particulars of the patriotic loco-foco movement yesterday in which the Whigs was so chawed up, and the last Alabama gouging case, and the interesting Arkansas duel with Bowie knives, and all the political, commercial, and fashionable news. Here they are, here they are. Here's the papers, here's the papers. Here's the sewer, cried another. Here's the New York sewer. Here's some of the 12,000 of today's sewer, with the best accounts of the markets and all the shipping news, and 4 whole columns of country correspondence, and a full account of the ball at Mrs. White's last night, where all the beauty and fashion of New York was assembled, with the sewer's own particulars of the private lives of all the ladies that was there. Here's the sewer. Here's some of the 12,000 edition of the sewer. Here's the sewer's exposure of the Wall Street gang, and the sewer's exposure of the Washington gang, and the sewer's exclusive account of a flagrant act of dishonesty committed by the Secretary of State when he was 8 years old, now communicated at a great expense by his own nurse. Here's the sewer. Well, it's not exactly the most attractive view of the press in New York or anywhere else, and Dickens actually wasn't really playing very fair when you think about it, because that kind of hustling and all that kind of sort of raucous go-get-em news gathering, New York was really one of a kind. There's no other city like it. I mean, no place had so many daily papers scrambling for readers and weeklies claiming turf of their own, from the Sun that boasted that it shone for all the way down to the more acquired taste of papers with the names like the Red Flag, the Subterranean, and the Alligator. I mean, there's a striking number of papers out there. But in point of fact, the truth of this is, this tells you something about the press before the war. We should be so lucky. You guys should be so lucky in whatever city or town you're in to imagine a town that can host as many as 8 or 9 daily papers at a time. And New York was more like a dozen, really. Cincinnati, there's 3 daily papers, sometimes even 4 out there. It's a striking thing. I mean, you go to Cincinnati and you don't like Wash McLean's Cincinnati Enquirer, you just pick up the Gazette. If you don't like the Gazette, you pick up the Commercial. If you don't like the Commercial, you pick up the Times, or you pick up the West and the South. You could take any of those papers, or all of them, if you actually want a well-rounded news. I mean, if you wanted to go to Boston, you could get the Journal, the Post, the Atlas, the Bee, the Leader, the Transcript, the Traveler, the Courier, and the Daily Advertiser. Every single one of them a daily paper out there. And for that matter, I mean, if you were really a person that wanted to see everything, in the morning as you're heading to work, you can buy a copy of the Morning Journal, and in the evening you can buy, on your way home, you can buy the Evening Journal, and you can find different columns and different news in each one of them. It's that kind of world out there. You're a German speaker in New York, or in Baltimore, and Cincinnati, or Chicago, you got your pick of German language newspapers. There's several going at the same time out there. It's a wonderful time for news. It's an exciting time for news, and there's not a question about that. Now, I'm not saying you find this richness everywhere, but almost any community north of the Mason-Dixon line, north of the Ohio River, and quite a few south of it, if it's got 5,000 people, it's going to have at least 2 newspapers. That's the basic rule of thumb. I mean, who thinks that a place like, say, Brattleboro, Vermont, is big enough for 2 newspapers at any time? Well, of course, it had at least 2 of them out there. New Haven, Connecticut had 3 or 4, and at that point, it's got maybe about what? Maybe 25,000 people at most? No, not really much. It's a reality out there. The reality is, in point of fact, that you can afford it because these places, they never lack for readers. They're going to find them everywhere. Now, your small newspaper in a lot of your dinky little towns, Pee Wee Valley and I don't know where else, they're not going to be able to afford a stable of reporters. They're lucky if they could buy newsprint, but all they need is a pair of scissors and a pot of glue. You just clip things out of the papers by exchanges that you get, and you can quote it all over the place, and it's just chock full of things. That's standard business out there. Now, Louisville out there, Louisville has some wonderful newspapers, including a wonderful newspaper that one of our panel tonight has worked for, the Courier-Journal. Back then it was called the Journal, and there was also a Courier elsewhere. Well, that paper, you may think, is not really of national significance, but my goodness, the editor, George D. Prentice, his remarks you can find in Vermont, you can find it in Boston, because he's so good. He's so sharp out there. As he would complain at one point, people seem to think they got a natural right to steal from Shakespeare and the Bible and us. And why he put himself third, I have no real idea. Well, the fact of the matter is, in metropolitan dailies and so on, even when you take a metropolitan daily, I mean, readers don't have to go for dishes of leftovers. They can get the big city publishers' selections of their own choicest bits. Horace Greeley, for example, New York Tribune, marvelous paper, big daily paper. But for every 1 copy that they sell in the city of it, they sell about 6 across the country. Iowa farmers can't wait for the weekly edition of the New York Tribune to come out to see what Horace Greeley is going to talk about today, because Horace Greeley was exciting. He's a lively, vigorous kind of spokesman there with, I might add, the worst handwriting of anyone in the entire world. It is said, for example, that at one point Horace Greeley was mad at a typesetter and he sent him a note of dismissal, and the penmanship was so bad that the man who was dismissed, who actually could read it, immediately took it across the street to the New York Herald, claimed it was a letter of recommendation, and got hired on the spot. I mean, it's quite an achievement out there. I mean, not a question of it. And we're talking papers. And in the big cities, if they've got about 10 pages of paper every day, just chock full of news, that's a normal kind of a day. You get down to 6, and it must be thin out there. In other words, there's a lot more news than you'll find in any newspaper today. today, except possibly the New York Times. The big city papers are quite spectacular. Now, all of that might sound like a mighty big plus in favor of the press gang and in favor of the newspapers. But my story is, in fact, one in many ways to suggest several, well, kind of disturbing things. And I'm going to kind of wing it here. Every so often I'll look at my notes, and every so often I'll be kind of impromptu. It'll be kind of like a sort of a presidential press conference, I suppose. Not of the present president. I'm thinking of some of the other ones out there, of course. But if you want to take a look at it and see, well, let's see what we can say. What's wrong with this newspaper media thing? Well, one thing I would suggest that really leads on to the Civil War is they tell us those newspapers are so good that they told the American people too much. The second reason why it leads on to the Civil War is that they told the American people too little. And the third is they told them things that were just plain not so. And this is what, oh no, how could that happen? Thank goodness we're away from these terrible early days of press reporting. Well, when I'm talking about just plain not so, I'm talking about it in the most amazing of cases. I mean, if you want to go to the end of the Civil War, you probably didn't know about the French intervening on the side of the Confederacy and gunboats coming up the Mississippi River and bombarding Union positions, did you, out there? But you can find that in the press if you want to find it. Maybe if you want to look in 1864, you would be amazed at the coverage from Southern papers of General Sherman's retreat from Atlanta to the sea. It's just a heart-rending kind of thing. There's a lot of that stuff out there. There's sometimes maniac stuff, but it's real. No, it works a little bit differently like that. And one kind of thing out there is that you have to ask yourself, how can a big city newspaper afford 7 or 8 or 9 presses? How can a small town afford 2? Well, the answer is it has a lot to do with the polarization of public opinion. That there's one for each political side of the spectrum, and it is going to tell you what that part of the spectrum has. Any of you remember ever seeing Citizen Kane? How many of you have seen Citizen Kane? You remember that moment when Charles Foster Kane loses the election and they've got a choice between the headlines, victory at the polls, victory on the one hand and fraud at the polls on the other? That's exactly the way it works out there. That's exactly the way it works. Because in every town, you've got to have 2 newspapers. You've got to have one that's Democrat and the other that's Whig, or one that's Democrat and the other that's Republican, or the truth will not get out. Those papers aren't there for the purpose of publishing news. They're recruiting sergeants. They're for the purpose of making people belong to that political party and support it once you get out of town. And in New York, anybody that's going to read the New York Herald is going to probably be a Democrat. And anybody who reads the New York Times is probably going to be a Republican or a Whig. And anybody who reads the New York Tribune is just going to get an enormous amount of material and wonder very much where its editor is and how he can stand to be in any kind of party out there. It's a striking kind of thing. In other words, every paper has its own kind of constituency out there, and it has its own point of view. Well, why is that a problem? Let's take a few reasons why there's a problem. If everybody's got their own point of view, sometimes it's going to be mighty difficult for you to figure out where the truth actually lies, and in fact it's going to be mighty easy to assume that the other people out there have some kind of deal with the Antichrist. I mean, it's not a surprising kind of thing. It's expected out there. I mean, for example, let's just take a simple case. Let's say you really think that Kansas, the territory of Kansas, is menaced by the slave power conspiracy, and you want to read every last outrage against free state families. Well, you're going to go first to the Tribune, and you're going to go to its correspondents out in Kansas. It'll tell you everything horrible that you imagined in the first place. On the other hand, if you think that the people who are worried about slavery in the territories are just a bunch of quote-unquote freedom shriekers, you're going to read the New York Herald, which will tell you that everything's fine in the territory if it weren't for those crazy fanatics that are probably feminists as well. I mean, that kind of thing. I mean, that's sort of the standard out there. And every editor is going to go out of his way to persuade people that truth is such a precious thing because it's so rare. There just isn't enough to go around, and even he has to use the truth very, very sparingly in case it runs out. Well, I mean, what are we talking about here in that kind of sense? What we're talking about is every newspaper is going to denounce every other newspaper as liars. So the Democratic neighbor of the New York Times ranks it as that mint of lies, slander, and mischief, and the Kennebec Journal in Augusta agrees that the Eastern Argus has a happy manner of stating the truth sometimes, though we graciously acquit it of ever doing so intentionally, it can be said. And then we see one New York editor who had done his training in Maine, and of him, the Kennebec paper says, in his New York career he has made up his lack of brains by a superfluity of lying and by ministering to the most depraved political prejudices in a great metropolis, and has worked himself up to where he can slander and vilify those whose shoe latchets he is not worthy to untie. Well, you look at that kind of ferocity and that polarization out there, and you can kind of see what it really means. It means, in fact, the no-holds-barred journalism that has really no journalistic standards. I go back to Horace Greeley responding to an editorial in the New York Evening Post. His response to it was an editorial that was one of the shortest editorials on record. So I have memorized it. "You lie, villain, willfully, meanly, basely lie!" Exclamation point. That's it. I mean, it's as simple as that out there. Now, all of this means that we've got newspapers that are biased, and it's not just on the editorial page. It's in news reporting in ways that today we can hardly imagine, except in certain kind of online media sites out there. We can discover, for example, that in Congress, the reports will tell you that whoever is on their side, their speeches are unanswerable, and the ones on the opposite side are flat failures. Now, we may look at newspaper reporting, and we may be bothered. I'm sure some of us are by the way people talk, but I don't really think that you're going to have reporters today who, in just a Washington correspondent's report on a debate, will refer to one of its opponents there by saying that the Michigan senator, he is a very unprepossessing man with a mean, repulsive countenance, which, with his narrow, illiberal feelings, more befits him for a petty constable than a senator. That's not what you find in news organs out there. Editorial pages, perhaps, but not in the news. Or we have Charles Sumner, the senator from Massachusetts, who had been struck down by the blows of Congressman Preston Brooks and was still so much of an invalid that he could barely attend the sessions, and it was almost a heroic endeavor if he could actually physically show up for a vote that he felt had to be had. And what does the news correspondent of the Charleston Mercury say of this appearance of Sumner to vote? "Mr. Sumner of Massachusetts, for the second time this session, appeared today in his seat to vote against Compton. This mastodon of hypocrisy, cowardice, and infamy, as he passed out of the Senate to the rotunda with his hangdog look, excited the ridicule and contempt of the spectators as they looked upon his gross, beefy carcass, which he would have his nigger-worshipping friends believe was still laboring under the affliction of great feebleness and debility." That's the news columns out there. It gives you a disturbing fact. In other words, the bias is everywhere. The bias is big. The bias is very, very ugly. And one reason why the bias is there is outside of the major cities, the way newspapers are paid for is by political parties. They're not just doing it for love, though they may be doing it for love. They're doing it for contracts. They're doing it for advertising from the government. They're doing it for printing contracts, so the right to publish the laws out there and get paid for them. Or, in fact, the right to be appointed postmaster. Because remember, there's no civil service rules back then. You appoint a person as postmaster when your party comes in. And being postmaster means you can send your newspaper for free to subscribers, and opponents' newspapers, well, they kind of get lost before they get there, or maybe they get stuffed in your attic and people don't find out about it for 4 or 5 years, by which time the news isn't very new. Well, that happens. Well, you look at all that, and in other words, what we have is we have a pretty ugly kind of situation. It means that, say, if you're a Democratic newspaper in the 1850s, you are essentially a bought and paid hireling. And you can't afford to disagree with the Democratic administration on anything because you'll lose your contract, which means that no matter what it is, you will be delighted at the way things work. You're not just distorting the truth. You're distorting the truth very deliberately to persuade Democratic voters that their party is doing the right thing when it is desperately, terribly, absurdly wrong out there. Now, I take that argument and I use two kind of examples of that. One kind of example I want to use right now is the story about Compton. You don't know about Compton. No reason why you should. 1857. You all heard of Bleeding Kansas, right? You've heard of the fight in the territory over whether that territory shall be made slave or made free. And you know how in 1855, I'm sure you all know, how in 1855, Missourians armed with guns, armed with artillery and rifles, came across the border into the territory of Kansas, drove away the bona fide residents, voted in pro-slavery candidates for the legislature, and then went home again. Well, that pro-slavery legislature out there leads to a virtual civil war in the territory of Kansas. But in 1857, that legislature, that pro-slavery rigged legislature, decides it's time to bring Kansas in as a state. So they call a constitutional convention. They hold elections for it, and a constitutional convention is held in a place called the Compton. And the members of that convention are, every single one of them, in favor of slavery. How could they all be elected that way? How could that happen, you think? Well, the moment they come in, they decide they're going to write a constitution that brings in Kansas as a slave state. But they also know that if they put that constitution up for a popular vote, it's going to lose 10-1. And so they decide they won't even let the people have a vote on it. They're going to have it sent straight on to Washington and have the Congress admit Kansas as a slave state without a popular vote. And just to look as if there's a little bit of public play, the clause that really enshrines slavery is the one thing they allow to go before the voters on December 21st, 1857. Well, I don't have to tell you what happens in Washington. President James Buchanan, who still, I'm sorry to say, whatever your other choices are, ranks as the absolute worst president in all of American history. Else, let me tell you, with James Buchanan, nobody else is likely to come close for a very, very long time. I shouldn't be unkind to him. In fact, some of you may have visited his home in Wheatland. You probably know that you can buy little rubber frogs that squeak there, because he once said that his time in the presidency was so miserable that he hoped in the next life he would come back as a frog sitting on a lily pond by a quiet mill stream where nothing ever happened. Well, I'm sorry. The whole rule of transmigration is you have to be good in this life to come back as a higher form of life. It just doesn't work. Well, in point of fact, James Buchanan decides that even though it's very clear the people of Kansas don't want to come into a slave state, he's going to force them into the Union as a slave state. And he splits the Democratic Party wide open. Well, why doesn't every Democrat in the North shout, "This is not democracy, this is not popular sovereignty"? Well, the answer is because so many of them are feeding at the public trough. And when James Buchanan tells them that he wants the Kansas to come in as a slave state, they all find good excuses for it. They say, look, the people of Kansas, they could have voted for members of the convention and brought in free staters, and they chose not to vote. And so it's their own fault if this convention was pro-slavery. And look, the slavery clause has been opened up and allowed for people to vote on that, and that's perfectly fine. And so that was the only issue that anybody really cared about after all. And besides, if they don't like it, they can amend this Constitution as soon as they come in, or throw it out and make a free state Constitution. So it really is okay. What's the big deal? What those newspapers do not say, and what everybody knows, is number one, when the vote came for that to elect delegates of the Constitutional Convention, the Free Staters couldn't have voted in their people because the pro-slavery legislature made sure that nobody was registered to vote in half the counties of Kansas, the Republican counties, the Free State counties, so no polls were open. And the fact of the matter is, yes, the people have a right to vote on the slavery clause of the Constitution, but not the clause that says that any slaves in the territory now, or ever born from those slaves, or their inheritors, shall always be slaves, and the legislature can do nothing about it. And they don't mention that that Constitution also forbids the people of Kansas to change their Constitution for the next 6 years. In other words, it is a fraud. And all across the country, you find Democratic editors yapping like crazy to try to defend it. What's the effect? The effect is that the Democratic Party is pulled to pieces. Half of them with James Buchanan, and across the North, many, many Northern Democrats, horrified by this, backing Stephen A. Douglas. Kansas does not come in as a slave state. But the effect of this is a Democratic Party pulled so far apart that in 1860, you don't have one candidate for president running as a Democrat. You have two, Douglas and a Southern Democrat, John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. Now, the Democratic Party is a strong election, but it's a strong party, but it's not strong enough to run two candidates for president at the same time in the same year and win. And the result is that Lincoln gets 39% of the popular vote and an electoral landslide, which of course sets off the destruction, in fact, of the Union, doesn't it? Now, if that were the only story, that might sound like the war being caused by idiots in the North. I'm sorry, there's a lot more idiots in the South that do it. You think, after all, if you're a Democrat, you say, oh, I don't know, Columbus, Ohio, or Cleveland, if you get suspicious about what your Democratic paper is saying, you can always be able to buy up a Republican paper and see what they're saying and compare notes out there. You can't do that in the South. It's not worth your while to publish a Republican newspaper in the South because you will die. You will be killed. It is as simple as that. Your press will be smashed. You will be driven out of there. There is a deliberate clamping down to make it impossible for Republicans to get their message out. Why is this important? Why is this significant in 1860? Well, let's really talk about it a little bit. What did the Republicans stand for in 1860? What did Lincoln stand for? What did even the most radical Republicans stand for? Were they for the abolishing of slavery? They were not. Were they for eliminating the fugitive slave law that would use federal force to trap and take back runaways who were accused of being slaves? They were not in favor of doing that. Were many of them willing to pass a constitutional amendment guaranteeing the protection of slavery in those states that had it? They were. Now that may sound to you outlandish, but it is the truth. And again, Republicans in the campaign say, all we're saying is slavery shall not go into the Western territories. We're not saying that we wouldn't admit another slave state in time if the people of the territory wanted slavery. We're not saying that Texas can't divide itself into 4 states, which had been promised to do under the treaty by which it was annexed at any time it wanted, and that we wouldn't admit them. We're not saying that we're going to strike any blow at slavery in the states of the South. We are not. We say this again and again. And you might as well have kept silent, because none of that word is going south. None of that word can go south. None of that word is allowed to go south. No campaign speakers are allowed to go into the South to make their case. And across the South, you find the newspapers declaring the Republicans are radicals. The Republicans are like John Brown. The Republicans will carry torches and slave insurrection with them. The Republican candidate for vice president, Hannibal Hamlin of Maine, is actually a Negro. It's all out there in the press, and there is nobody and nothing to answer it. And all through 1860, instead, you will find presses in the South that suggest there is a clear and present danger to slavery from this invented Republican Party. And all across the South in 1860, you find constant reports being made. Reports of abolitionists in the South, reports of new John Browns spreading strychnine and pouring it into the wells of Texas, arsonists burning down the towns, all stories that are made up out of the whole cloth, all stories that are nonsense. People in Texas, in Brownsville, opened their newspaper amazed to find that their town had been burnt to ashes, according to Alabama newspapers. Why hadn't they been told about this? It would be important in their lives, but it's all out there. In other words, I do not have to tell you that by the time Lincoln is elected, you've got a Deep South in absolute terror of phantoms, of chimeras, of illusions that simply are not true. And you've got a Republican Party that cannot get the word out. What if, in fact, the Republican Party had been able to speak in the South? What if, in fact, they had made quite clear that the only thing they wanted was to make sure that the territories remained free? Would there have been secession? I don't think so. I don't think it would have happened. And in point of fact, it seems to me that this is really where the story goes. This is what the story is about. Now, all of what I'm saying right here suggests to me something pretty critical. Now, all roads may not lead to Rome, no matter how many people say that they do. But sometimes it really seems as if all roads lead straight to Fort Sumter. It really feels that way to me. Lots of things caused the Civil War. You can name some, I can name some, and plenty of them out there. But newspapers that did their duty to their party or their constituencies and not to the truth certainly should share some of the blame, I think. The road to hell may not be paved with good intentions, but looking at the lies and the flashes of brilliant silence and the distortions, it's hard not to feel that the road to war was paved with newspaper print.